Owen, Sassoon and Graves, a lecture in 7 parts. Part 1, The Meeting of Graves and Sassoon. November 1915. The Great War has been raging for 15 months. In northern France, the rain and slush of the trenches gives way to a hard frost. 20-year-old Captain Robert Graves of the 3rd Battalion Royal Welsh Fusiliers is instructed to join the 1st Battalion in their billets behind Festubert. Each night, working parties are sent out to dig new trenches. A diarist among them writes, Thursday, November the 25th. Went on working party 3 to 10:30. Marched to Festubert village, a ruined place, shelled to shreds. About 4:30 in darkness and rain, started up 3/4 of a mile of light tram lines through marsh with 60 men carrying hurdles. It took 2 hours. Flares go up frequently. A few shells go high overhead. Finally emerge in a place behind the 1st and 2nd line trenches where we're digging new trenches with high command breastworks. Friday, November the 27th, go out again, starting 9:45 in brilliant moonlight and iron frost. Dig from 12 to 2, home 4:25. Men get soup in ruined house in Festubert. The moon shines through matchwood skeleton rafters of roofs. The diarist was 29-year-old Captain Siegfried Sassoon of B Company, and the next day, Saturday, saw him and Captain Graves of A Company walking into Bethune for tea. Sassoon, in civilian life, a fox-hunting country gentleman, had taken a commission with the Royal Welsh Fusiliers earlier in 1915. Slim, wiry, dark-haired and elegantly dressed. He was a man of many contradictions. Longing for praise, he was also instinctively reclusive, and in appearance, his thoughtful eyes and sensitive mouth contrasted with a firm chin, a nose which appeared too large for the rest of his face, and ears which stuck out awkwardly. He had only recently arrived in France, and so although he was 9 years older than Robert, he was his junior in military experience, having seen no frontline service. Graves, in civilian life, poised halfway between Charterhouse schoolboy and Oxford undergraduate, had signed up in August 1914 within 8 days of the outbreak of war, outraged by the German violation of Belgian neutrality. He was aware that he himself was violating all my most cherished anti-war principles, but France is the only place for a gentleman now, principles or no principles. Robert was a tall, untidy, eccentric man with a broken nose, always prepared to modify his views when he heard a better argument than his own, but steadfast in his opinions when he did not. Easy to please, but quick to take offense. Usually ready with a smile and a warm handshake, but occasionally just as ready with his clenched fists. I'll tell you just a little about his school days. He spent 5 years at Charterhouse, which was, when he arrived, a dreadful school for anyone who, like him, had been brought up by a saintly mother to be a good person. This had unfortunately made him into a frightful prig, with the result that he was very much disliked and badly bullied. In March 1911, he writes to his parents to tell them that I must leave Charterhouse because I cannot stand life here any longer. And he told them about the ferocious bullying to which he was being subjected. He now had a study, but there was no lock on the door, and it was always being wrecked. as a last desperate measure, Robert began pretending to be mad. He had taken this idea from the Bible, where he had read in the first book of Samuel how David, when sore afraid of Achish, the king of Gath, had changed his behavior before them and feigned himself mad in their hands and scrabbled on the doors of the gate and let his spittle fall down upon his beard. Then at last, he began to find relief from his unhappiness in writing poetry. This was apparently considered by many of his schoolfellows to be stronger proof of his insanity than the straws he wore in his hair. But not everyone felt like this, and one of the first of his new poems was published in the June number of the school magazine, The Carthusian. In it, Robert wrote with undeniable power about the wild country about Arinfa, the holiday home which his parents owned near Harlech in North Wales. It was called The Mountainside at Evening. Now even falls, and fresh, cold breezes blow adown the grey-green mountainside, strewn with rough boulders. Soft and low night speaks, her tongue untied, darkness to darkness calls. 'Tis now, men say, from rugged piles of stones, steel shapes, and things that should be still, green terror ripples through our bones. Our inmost heartstrings thrill and yearn for careless day. Robert was now nearly 16 years old, and it was from this time, as he later recorded, that poetry became his ruling passion. To avoid the bullying which continued, he also learned to box. Shortly before he left Charterhouse, the house monitors burst into his study and went through his private papers and poems, and when the head monitor failed to apologise for what had happened, Robert gave him a ferocious knockout punch, for which he came close to being expelled. Fortunately, he had an understanding headmaster. To return to the war, over tea at Bethune, Sassoon found Graves an interesting creature, overstrung and self-conscious, a defiler of conventions. Later, the battalion was moved for training to a village in Picardy, some 30 miles away from the front line, and there the friendship between the two men deepened. Both were poets, though neither had yet been published except in school magazines or, in Sassoon's case, in privately printed limited editions. They also had in common their friendship with that great patron of poets, Sir Edward Marsh, and they were soon reading each other's work. Sassoon, he liked some of Graves's more fanciful poems, finding them full of promise and real beauty, but he loathed others, including, no doubt, The Morning Before Battle, which ran, "Today the fight. My end is very soon," and sealed the warrant limiting my hours. I knew it yesterday, walking at noon down a deserted garden full of flowers, carelessly sang, pinned roses on my breast, reached for a cherry branch, and then death blew through the garden from the north and east and blighted every beauty with chill breath. I looked and my wraith before me stood, his head all battered in by violent blows. The fruit between my lips to clotted blood was transubstantiate, and the pale rose smelt sickly, till it seemed through a swift tear flood that dead men blossomed in the garden close. In his diary, Siegfried described poems of this kind as very bad, violent and repulsive, and stated he shouldn't publish yet. In conversation, naturally, he was a bit more restrained, simply telling Robert, "My dear boy, some of your poems are a bit too realistic." Robert, with his first-hand experience of trench warfare, couldn't accept this. He felt it was Siegfried's poems which were too unrealistic. In fact, Siegfried had begun as a typical poet of the early part of the war, writing before he had even arrived in France his heavily sentimental poem To Victory, which begins, "Return to greet me, colours that were my joy, not in the woeful crimson of men slain, but shining as a garden, come with the streaming banners of dawn and sundown after rain. I want to fill my gaze with blue and silver." It's not very nice stuff, really, is it? Part 2, Graves, Sassoon and David Thomas. The remainder of December 1915 and the first weeks of January 1916 were spent in training. Graves and Sassoon gradually became close friends. Sassoon found Graves at his best, an ideal companion, though his opinions were often disconcerting. But no one was worse than he at hitting it off with officers who distrusted his cleverness and disliked unreserved utterances. In fact, he was a positive expert at putting people's backs up unintentionally. He was also deplorably untidy, and his absent-mindedness when off duty was another propensity which made him unpopular. Also, he wasn't very good at being seen but not heard. Far too fond of butting in with his opinion before he's been asked for it, was often his only reward for an intelligent suggestion. Both Graves and Sassoon became equally close with Second Lieutenant David Thomas of the 3rd Battalion, who one of them described as a simple, gentle fellow and fond of reading. In March 1917, all three of them were back in the line in the Fricourt trenches on the Somme. It was there that on the 18th of March, there was a disastrous night in which a number of officers were killed, and among them was Lieutenant David Thomas. He had been hit by a stray bullet in the neck and a few minutes later choked to death. The following evening, there was a burial service. Sassoon and Graves were both among the mourners. In the half-clouded moonlight, wrote Sassoon, the parson stood above the graves, and everything was dim, but the striped flag laid across them. Robert Graves beside me, with his white, whimsical face, twisted and grieving. Once we could not hear the solemn words for the noise of a machine gun along the line, and when all was finished, a canister fell a few yards away from us to burst with a crash. So David left us, a gentle soldier, perfect and without stain. Robert himself recalled, I felt David's death worse than any other death since I had been in France. It just made me feel empty and lost. And he penned a somber set of verses entitled Goliath and David, in which the story is very different from the one in the Bible. See, I'm sure all of you know this, the 17th chapter of the first book of Samuel. Now, the authorized version of the Bible, so far as I'm concerned, is an undisputable masterpiece. Scholars correctly but stupidly explain that it isn't a very accurate translation. To which one can only say, so what? It's one of the finest works in the English language. In the Bible, the last part of the story runs like this. And when the Philistine looked about and saw David, he disdained him, for he was but a youth and ruddy and of a fair countenance. And the Philistine said unto David, Am I a dog that thou comest to me with staves? And the Philistine cursed David by his gods. And the Philistine said to David, Come to me, and I will give thy flesh unto the fowls of the air, unto the beasts of the field. Then said David to the Philistine, "Thou comest to me with a sword, and with a spear, and with a shield. But I come to thee in the name of the Lord of hosts, the God of the armies of Israel, whom thou hast defied. This day will the Lord deliver thee into mine hand, and I will smite thee and take thine head from thee, and I will give the carcasses of the host of the Philistines this day unto the fowls of the air, unto the wild beasts of the earth, that all the earth may know there is a God in Israel." And David took a stone and slang it, and smote the Philistine in his forehead, that the stone sunk into his forehead, and he fell upon his face to the earth. So David prevailed over the Philistine with a sling and with a stone, and smote the Philistine and slew him. But now, in Graves' words, the historian of that fight had not the heart to tell it right. In his view, the true story ends with Goliath's shield parrying all David's stones, and then scorn blazes in the giant's eye, towering unhurt 6 cubits high. Says foolish David, "Damn your shield, and damn my sling, but I'll not yield." He takes his staff of Mamre oak, a knotted shepherd's staff that's broke the skull of many a wolf and fox come filching lambs from Jesse's flocks. Loud laughs Goliath, and that laugh can scatter chariots like blown chaff to rout. But David, calm and brave, holds his ground, for God will save. Steel crashes wood, a flash, and oh, shame for beauty's overthrow. God's eyes are dim, his ears are shut. One cruel backhand saber cut. "I'm hit, I'm killed," young David cries, throws blindly forward, chokes, and dies. And look, spike-helmeted, grey, grim, Goliath straddles over him. Part 3, Wild, Tremendous Things. Graves was out of the front line until July 1916, for much of the time in England, where Over the Brazier, his first book of poems, was published to reviews which he described as very affable mostly. In his absence, Sassoon had become so recklessly daring since David Thomas's death that he had acquired the nickname Mad Jack. In June, he was awarded the Military Cross for conspicuous gallantry during a raid on the enemy's trenches, when he remained for 12 hours under rifle fire and bomb fire, collecting and bringing in our wounded. And he was recommended for a further decoration after his action of the 6th of July, when he single-handedly bombed his way into an enemy trench and drove 50 or 60 Germans to take refuge in Mametz Wood. On the 14th of July 16, the two men met again and had a long talk. Siegfried found Robert whimsical and odd and human as ever. We sat in the darkness with guns booming along the valleys and dim stars of campfires burning all around in the dark countryside, and a grey, cloudy sky overhead and the moon hid. And there I left him, with his men sleeping a little way off. Tomorrow they'll be up in the battle. Sassoon was now convinced that in Graves, if they both survived the war, he had found a lifelong friend to work with. They had talked of travelling in the East together, and Siegfried noted that whenever I'm with him, I want to do wild things and get right away from the conventional silliness of my old life. The following day, Robert moved up to the front with his men. Eventually, they reached the edge of Mametz Wood, which was full of the dead, and in which there was not a single tree unbroken. From here, Graves wrote a long verse letter to Sassoon about their plans. After the war, he imagined, the two of them would kiss our families and sail away across the seas, the god of song protecting us, to the great hills of Caucasus. Robert will learn the local bat for billeting and things like that, if Siegfried learns the piccolo to charm the people as we go. Perhaps eventually we'll get among the Tartars of Tibet, hobnobbing with the Chungs and Mings and doing wild, tremendous things in free adventure, quest and fight. And God, what poetry we'll write. Robert was not, however, blind to the horrors of what lay about him. In the same envelope as that very amusing, entertaining verse, he enclosed these lines on Mamet's wood. Today I found in Mamet's wood a certain cure for lust of blood, where, propped against a shattered trunk, in a great mess of things unclean, sat a dead Boche. He scowled and stunk, with clothes and a face a sodden green, big-bellied, spectacled, crop-haired, dribbling black blood from nose and beard. 5 days later, the Royal Welsh were lying in reserve on a ridge where the Germans had put down a heavy barrage. As Robert wrote later, it was heavy stuff, 6 and 8 inch. There was so much of it that we decided to move back 50 yards. It was when I was running that an 8-inch shell burst about 3 paces behind me. I was able to work that out afterwards by the line of my wounds. I heard the explosion and felt as though I'd been punched rather hard between the shoulder blades, but had no sensation of pain. I thought that the punch was merely the shock of the explosion. Then blood started trickling out of my eye, and I felt faint. And I called to the company commander, "I've been hit." Then I fell down. Taken to a dressing station at the northern end of Mamet's Wood, Robert was left quietly in a corner to die. But the following morning, when orderlies were clearing away the dead, they were astonished to find that Captain Graves was still breathing. He was put in an ambulance and began bumping along the shell-pitted road which led westward and away from the war. He was jolted for a brief while into screaming consciousness, but soon he was silent again, and although he was still alive when the ambulance reached the nearest field hospital, he was deeply unconscious, and a report reached Colonel Crawshay that he had died of wounds on the way down. Part 4, Serious Doubts. Robert Graves survived to read his own obituary in the Times. He quite enjoyed that, I think. And the end of August 1916 found him convalescing at his parents' home in Harlech. There he was joined by Sassoon, and on one Wednesday evening, the two men attended a village concert to raise money for a war charity. But despite this public appearance, they had both begun to have serious doubts about whether it was right for the war to be continued. Its continuance, they said, and it seems merely a sacrifice of the idealistic younger generation to the stupidity and self-protective alarm of the elder. However, in November, when the two men were lunching in town, Siegfried declared that we have to keep up the good reputation of the poets as men of courage. He meant the best place for us is back in France, away from the more shameful madness of home service. Our function there is not to kill Germans, though that may happen, but to make things easier for the men under our command. January 1917 therefore saw Robert briefly back in the front line. However, he went down with severe bronchitis and found himself back in the Rouen hospital to which he had been admitted the previous July. The mayor of the Royal Army Medical Corps, astonished to see him again, asked him, "What on earth are you doing out in France again, young man?" And then added very severely, "If I find you in hospital again with those lungs of yours, I'll have you court-martialed." So, back to England, where he suffered from some kind of nervous collapse and was admitted to Osborne Hospital on the Isle of Wight, temporarily a convalescent home for officers. Now, Sassoon had also been back in the front line, where he had been wounded in the shoulder by a sniper's bullet, and also sent back to England, where on May the 8th, a collection of his poems was published, The Old Huntsman. Convalescing down in Kent, he was actually in a very much worse mental state than Robert, and wrote to tell him that the thought of all that happens in France nearly drives me dotty sometimes. I can hear the guns thudding all the time across the channel, on and on, until I don't know whether I want to rush back and be with the 1st Battalion or stay in England and do what I can to prevent the war going on. But both courses are hopeless. When he returned to London, he suffered from the most terrifying hallucinations, so that often when he went out, he would look down and see corpses lying about on the pavement. Then in mid-June, encouraged by Bertrand Russell, he composed a statement which he described as an act of willful defiance of military authority, in which I declare that this war, upon which I entered as a war of defense and liberation, has now become a war of aggression and conquest. And he said that it was morally wrong for it to be prolonged. Then he circulated his statement to leading journalists, politicians, and writers. When Robert first read this statement, he did so with horror. "Oh, it's an awful thing, completely mad that he's done. I mean, I think he's quite right in his views, but completely and utterly wrong in his action." He approved of Sassoon's sentiments, but felt he was acting in a disloyal and dishonourable manner. Hearing that Sassoon had been ordered to report to Litherland, a military headquarters not far from Liverpool, Graves had himself discharged from Osborne so that he could follow him up there and, in his own words, attend to things. By the time he arrived, a court-martial followed by a firing squad seemed inevitable. Robert immediately went to call on Sassoon, whom we found looking very ill. "I've just been down to the water's edge and thrown my military cross into the sea." The two men talked together for a long time. Eventually, Graves persuaded Sassoon that the military authorities would never court-martial him, but would simply lock him away in a lunatic asylum. In those circumstances, his struggle would be futile. Sassoon gave way and agreed to go before a medical board, where Robert convinced them that Sassoon was in a state of mental collapse. So it was decided that Sassoon should be escorted up to a convalescent home at Craig Lockhart, where he was placed under the care of the eminent psychologist, Dr. W.H.R. Rivers. Part 5. Craig Lockhart and Wilfred Owen. About 5 weeks after Sassoon's arrival in what he described in letters as Dottyville, a rather nervous fellow patient called on him in his rooms and introduced himself as Second Lieutenant Wilfred Owen of the Manchesters. He explained that he had been reading and very much admiring Captain Sassoon's The Old Huntsman collection. As editor of the Hydra, the hospital magazine which he was editing, Owen wondered whether Sassoon had something to contribute. And as he was leaving, he remarked that, "I hope I may show you some of my own poems." Owen was now 24 years old. A friend wrote of him that His eyes were, I suppose, what struck one first in his appearance. Dark and vivid eyes, flashing now and then a startled look that indicated quickness of apprehension and extreme sensitiveness. The mouth emphasized that sensitiveness, but also counteracted it to some extent by the firmness of its lines. There was something curiously clear-cut and fluid about the features. The sentiment he aroused was one of tenderness and admiration. Owen's story was this. Born at Oswestry in 1893 and educated in Birkenhead and Shrewsbury, he had been tutoring in France when war broke out. In the autumn of 15, he returned to England, where he joined the Artist Rifles, and in June 16, he was commissioned into the Manchester Regiment. As for poetry, Owen had known himself to be a poet since his childhood and had written a great quantity of verse, none of which yet satisfied him. As recently as March 1915, he had written, "To be able to write as I know how to, study is necessary." A period of study, then of intercourse with kindred spirits. My heart is ready, but my brain unprepared and my hand untrained. I quite envisage the possibility of non-success. At the end of December 1916, he had been sent out to France, where in January 17 he had joined the 2nd Battalion, who were completing a 6 weeks' rest not far from the Somme battlefield, where sharp fighting was in progress. His first trench tour began in mid-January, and he had sent his mother a most terrifying account of the dangers to which he had been exposed. "I can see no excuse for deceiving you about these last 4 days. I have suffered 7th hell. I have not been at the front. I have been in front of it. I held an advanced post, that is a dugout, in the middle of no man's land. We had a march of 3 miles over shelled road, then nearly 3 more along a flooded trench. After that, we came to where the trenches had been blown flat out and had to go over the top. It was, of course, dark, too dark. And the ground was not mud, but an octopus of sucking clay, 3, 4, and 5 feet deep, relieved only by craters full of water. Men have been known to drown in them, many stuck in the mud, and only got on by leaving their waders, equipment, and in some cases their clothes. High explosives were dropping all around, and machine guns spluttered every few minutes. But it was so dark that even the German flares did not reveal us. Each of us 3/4 dead. We reached the dugout and relieved the wretches therein. I then had to go forth and find another dugout for a still more advanced post, where I left 18 bombers. My dugout held 25 men tight-packed. Water filled it to a depth of 1 or 2 feet, leaving, say, 4 feet of air. One entrance had been blown in and blocked. So far, the other remained. The Germans knew we were staying there and decided we shouldn't. Those 50 hours were the agony of my happy life. Every 10 minutes on Sunday afternoon seemed an hour. I nearly broke down and let myself drown in the water that was slowly rising over my knees. Towards 6 o'clock, when I suppose you would be going to church, the shelling grew less intense and less accurate, so that I was mercifully helped to do my duty and crawl, wade, climb and flounder over no man's land to visit my other post. I was chiefly annoyed by our own machine gun from behind. The seeing of the bullets reminded me of Mary's canary. On the whole, I can support the canary better. In the platoon on my left, The sentries over the dugout were blown to nothing. I kept my own sentries halfway down the stairs during the more terrific bombardment. In spite of this, one lad was blown down, and I'm afraid blinded. This was my only casualty. The officer of the left platoon has come out completely prostrated and is in hospital. The officer who relieved me left his 3 Lewis guns behind when he came out. He will be court-martialed. 5 months of terrible experiences followed. Owen described no man's land under snow as being like the face of the moon, chaotic, crater-ridden, uninhabitable, awful, the abode of madness. There was a period in the front when he and his platoon had no dugouts, but had to lie in the snow under the deadly wind, and the platoon cookers didn't suffice to melt the ice in the water cans, so we suffered cruelly from thirst. During a very brief escape from the front, he recalled hideous landscapes, vile noises, foul language, and nothing but foul, even from one's own mouth, for all a devil-ridden, everything unnatural, broken, blasted, the distortion of the dead, whose unburyable bodies sit outside the dugout all day, all night, and a week later to come back and find them still sitting there in motionless groups. That is what saps the soldierly spirit. By the beginning of May, his doctor was worried enough about Owen's nerves to send him out of the front line for a few days, and he took the opportunity to write to a brother as follows. The sensations of going over the top are about as exhilarating as those dreams of falling over a precipice when you see the rocks at the bottom surging up to you. I woke without being squashed. Some didn't. There was an extraordinary exultation in the act of slowly walking forward, showing ourselves openly. There was no bugle and no drum, for which I was very sorry. I kept up a kind of chanting sing-song. Keep the line straight. Not so fast on the left. Steady on the left. Not so fast. Then we were caught in a tornado of shells. The various waves were all broken up, and we carried on like a crowd moving off a cricket field. When I looked back and saw the ground all crawling and wormy with wounded bodies, I felt no horror at all, but only an immense exultation at having got through the barrage. Well, as you can understand, he was now suffering from shell shock. One story has it that he was feeling worse because his commanding officer had unjustly accused him of cowardice. He had certainly decided that fighting was wholly wrong. And in another letter, he wrote that, already I have comprehended a light which never will filter into the dogma of any national church, namely that one of Christ's essential commands was passivity at any price, suffer dishonor and disgrace, but never resort to arms. Be bullied, be outraged, be killed, but do not kill. Christ is literally in no man's land. There men often hear his voice. Greater love hath no man than this, that a man lay down his life for a friend. Is it spoken in English only and French? I don't believe so. Thus you see how pure Christianity will not fit in with pure patriotism. By the end of June 17, Wilfred Owen had reached Craiglockhart, where he made a rapid recovery from his shell-shock condition and was soon performing at concerts, lecturing, and, as I said earlier, editing the hospital magazine. And then towards the end of August came that meeting with Sassoon. Now, Sassoon first thought of Owen as a rather ordinary young man, though unobtrusively ardent in his responses to my lordly dictums about poetry. But he agreed to look at some of Owen's work, and then on the evening of the 7th of September, as Owen records, Sassoon called me into him, and having condemned some of my poems, amended others, and rejoiced over a few, he read me his very latest works, which are superb beyond anything in his book. I don't tell him so, or that I'm not worthy to light his pipe. I simply sit tight and tell him where I think he goes wrong. Now, up to this moment, Owen had felt isolated as a poet, but now he had found the kindred spirit for which he had been searching. The two men had in common their dedication to poetry and their hatred of the war. What especially distinguished Owen was what a friend of his called his intense pity for suffering humanity, a need to alleviate it wherever possible, and an inability to shirk the sharing of it, even when this seemed useless. This was the keynote of Wilfred's character. Indeed, it was simply Wilfred. Owen had long conversations with Sassoon about the terrible futility of the war and about what role a poet should play. They agreed, all a poet can do today is to warn. Owen began to understand that in war and the pity of war, he had found his subject, and during the next few weeks, he rapidly drafted a large number of the poems which have made him famous. Sassoon was at hand to help with the revisions. Sometimes he even advised about the titles. One poem he thought was an anthem. Just what I meant it to be, commented Owen, calling it Anthem for Dead Youth, until Sassoon suggested that Doomed would carry much more of an emotional charge. So now, for these lines, we have the title Anthem for Doomed Youth. What passing bells for these who die as cattle, only the monstrous anger of the guns, only the stuttering rifles' rapid rattle can patter out their hasty orisons. No mockeries for them from prayers or bells, nor any voice of mourning save the choirs, the shrill, demented choirs of wading shells, and bugles calling for them from sad shires. What candles may be held to speed them all? Not in the hands of boys, but in their eyes shall shine the holy glimmers of goodbyes. The pallor of girls' brows shall be their pall, their flowers, the tenderness of silent minds, and each slow dusk a drawing down of blinds. Sassoon did fully recognize Owen's genius by this time and would later say, my own importance was limited to giving Owen energy and occasion. He certainly had no wish to be the only influence upon Owen, and when he heard from Robert Graves that he was coming up to visit him at Craig Lockhart in October, he asked Owen to meet Graves's train and then to bring him over to the golf course where he'd be enjoying his morning round. Part 6, Owen, Graves, Sassoon and Graves. Owen was not very impressed with his first sight of my uncle. He described him in a letter to his mother the following day as a big, rather plain fellow, the last man on earth apparently capable of the extraordinary, delicate fancies in his works. Sassoon had showed Graves some of Owen's work when they were alone together, and Owen was thoroughly irritated to hear that Graves was mightily impressed and considers me a kind of find. No thanks, Captain Graves, I'll find myself in due time. However, Owen's resentment rapidly faded. He told his mother, Sassoon said of him, he's a man one likes better after he has been with one. So it turns out in my case. Some days later, Graves returned the draft of one of Owen's poems, Disabled, with some constructive critical advice. The poem now begins. He sat in a wheeled chair, waiting for dark, and shivered in his ghastly suit of grey, legless, sewn short at elbow. Through the park, voices of boys rang saddening like a hymn, voices of play and pleasures after day, till gathering sleep had mothered them from him. About this time, town used to swing so gay, when glow lamps budded in the light blue trees, and girls glanced lovelier as the air grew dim. In the old days, before he threw away his knees. Now he will never feel again how slim girls' waists are, or how warm their subtle hands. All of them touch him like some queer disease. In the same poem, he writes of another young man, an artist and a keen footballer, who had lied about his age, as many people did, in order to enlist. There was an artist, silly for his face, for it was younger than his youth last year. Now he is old. His back will never brace. He's lost his colour very far from here, poured it down shell holes till the veins ran dry, and half his lifetime lapsed in the hot race when deep of purples spurted from his thigh. One time, he liked a blood smear down his leg. After the matches, carried shoulder high. It was after football, when he had drunk a peg, he thought he had better join. He wonders why. Someone had said he'd look a god in kilts, that's why. And maybe, too, to please his Meg. Ah, that was it. To please the giddy jilts he asked to join. He didn't have to beg. Smiling, they wrote his lie, aged 19 years. Germans he scarcely thought of. All their guilt and Austria's did not move him. And no fears of fear came yet. He thought of jewelled hilts, of daggers in plaid socks, of smart salutes and care of arms and leave and pay arrears, esprit de corps and hints for young recruits. And soon he was drafted out with drums and cheers. Some cheered him home, but not as crowds cheer girl. Only a solemn man who brought him fruits thanked him and then inquired about his soul. Now he will spend a few sick years in institutes and do what things the rules consider wise and take whatever pity they may dole. Tonight he noticed how the women's eyes passed from him to the strong men that were whole. How cold and late it is. Why don't they come and put him into bed? Why don't they come? Graves supplied Owen with constructive critical advice, and Sassoon encouraged him in this valuable work, writing to him in October, "I'm so glad you like Owen's poems. I will tell him to send you on any decent stuff he does. His work is very unequal, and you can help him a great deal." At the end of October, Owen left Craiglockhart and went to Scarborough to rejoin the Manchesters. From there, in November, he wrote to Sassoon, "Know that since mid-September, when you still regarded me as a tiresome little knocker at your door, I held you as Keats, Christ plus Elijah, plus my colonel, plus my father confessor." What's that mathematically? If you consider what the above names have severally done for me, you will know what you are doing, and you have fixed my life, however short. You did not like me. I was always a mad comet, but you have fixed me. I spun round you a satellite for a month, but I shall swing out soon, a dark star in the orbit where you will blaze. It is some consolation to know that Jupiter himself sometimes swims out of ken. He added that he had ordered several copies of Robert Graves's book of poems, Fairies and Fusiliers, but shall not buy all, in order to leave the book exposed on the Shrewsbury counters. At the end of the year, Owen was still in England, and he wrote to his mother, "I go out of this year a poet, my dear mother, as I did not enter it. I am held peer by the Georgians. I am a poet's poet. I am started. The tugs have left me. I feel the great swelling of the open sea taking my galleon. On the 23rd of January 1918, Owen attended Robert's wedding at St. James's, Piccadilly, and in late July he visited Sassoon, who was in the American Red Cross Hospital in London, having been wounded in the head during another bout of active service. These were the last occasions on which Owen saw Graves and Sassoon. But what of these three men during the remainder of the war? Final part, part 7, cursing and sobbing and thinking of the dead. Robert Graves instructed cadets in North Wales, but after his wedding, he was no longer in the mood for writing bitter poems about death and destruction, writing instead fanciful lines like the much anthologized, "Ali, call the birds in, the birds from the sky. Ali calls, Ali sings, down they all fly." But at times, he would be overtaken by bouts of shell shock and would write more somber lines, such as these from Haunted about his falling comrades. "I meet you suddenly down the street. Strangers assume your phantom faces. You grin at me from daylight places. Dead, long dead. I'm ashamed to meet dead men down the morning street." Siegfried Sassoon returned to the Western Front, where, as he had promised, he did his best to look after the men under his command, but he continued to be infuriated by conventional attitudes to the war. One bishop he described as a well-nourished Anglican gramophone. He would have made an admirable butler had he been called to that profession, and he imagined the bishop with one hand on the knob of God's drawing-room door. "What name, sir?" Or talking to an old friend of the family as he relieves him of his overcoat and umbrella in the celestial entrance hall. "Yes, my lord, all the family are in the best of health. Mr. Jesus has been a little worried by this terrible war, like most of us. Likewise, the Holy Ghost, the Comforter. Yes, my lord, the Almighty is in the library and has inquired for you several times lately." And so, with deliberate, confidential mien, he leads the way up the soft carpeted stairs. "I stood with the dead," wrote Sassoon immediately afterwards. "I stood with the dead, so forsaken and still. When dawn was grey, I stood with the dead, and my slow heart said, 'You must kill, you must kill. Soldier, soldier, morning is red.' On the shapes of the slain in their crumpled disgrace, I stared for a while through the thin, cold rain. Oh, lad that I loved, there is death on your face, and your eyes are blurred and sick like the plain. I stood with the dead. They were dead, they were dead. My heart and my head beat a march of dismay, and gusts of the wind came, dulled by the guns. 'Fall in,' I shouted. 'Fall in for your pay.'" By the end of July 1918, Owen too was preparing to go overseas again. "Now must I throw my little candle on Sassoon's torch and go out again. There are rumours of a large draft of officers shortly." Like Sassoon, he felt that it was better to be out at the front with honest men who knew the truth about the war than at home with the ignorance and the war profiteers. And a few days later, he wrote, this is rather savage, I hope you'll forgive me. "This morning at 8:20, we heard a boat torpedoed in the bay about a mile out. They say who saw it. I think only 10 lives were saved. I wish the Boche would have the courage to come right in and make a clean sweep of the pleasure boats and the promenaders on the spar and all the stinking Leeds and Bradford war profiteers now reading John Bull on Scarborough Sands." In August, he was back in France, where he endured further horrors and won an MC after a successful but costly attack during which so many were killed that he became a temporary company commander and managed to hold the line against a counterattack until relieved. Not long after this, he wrote to his mother, "My nerves are in perfect order. I've come out to France with two objectives. First, to help these boys directly by leading them as well as an officer can, and indirectly by watching their sufferings, that I may speak of them as well as a pleader can." His first objective has certainly been achieved. As for the second, here is his sinister poem, Strange Meeting. It seemed that out of battle I escaped, down some profound, dull tunnel, long since scooped through granites which titanic wars had groined, yet also there encumbered sleepers groaned, too fast in thought or death to be bestirred. Then as I probed them, one sprang up and stared with piteous recognition in fixed eyes, lifting distressful hands as if to bless, and by his smile I knew that sullen hall. By his dead smile I knew we stood in hell. With 1,000 pains that vision's face was grained. Yet no blood reached there from the upper ground, and no guns thumped or down the flues made moan. "Strange friend," I said, "here is no cause to mourn." "None," said the other, "save the undone years, the hopelessness. Whatever hope is yours was my life also. I went hunting wild after the wildest beauty in the world, which lies not calm in eyes or braided hair, but mocks the stately running of the hour, and if it grieves, grieves richlier than here. For by my glee might many men have laughed, and of my weeping something have been left which must die now. I mean the truth untold, the pity of war, the pity war distilled. Now men will go content with what we spoiled, or discontent, boil, bloody, and be spilled. They will be swift with swiftness of the tigress. None will break ranks, though nations trek from progress. Courage was mine, and I had mystery. Wisdom was mine, and I had mastery, to miss the march of this retreating world into vain citadels that are not walled. Then, when much blood had clogged their chariot wheels, I would go up and wash them from sweet wells, even with truths that lie too deep for taint. I would have poured my spirit without stint, but not through wounds, not on the cess of war. Foreheads of men have bled where no wounds were. I am the enemy you killed, my friend. I knew you in the dark, for so you frowned yesterday through me as you jabbed and killed. I parried, but my hands were loath and cold. Let us sleep now. At last, on the 11th of November 1918, the guns fell silent along the Western Front. There was not much rejoicing, but not by Robert Graves, for as he later wrote in Goodbye to All That, I heard at the same time news of the death of Wilfred Owen, who often used to write to me from France, sending me his poems. The news sent me out walking alone along the dyke above the marches of Rhuddlan, cursing and sobbing and thinking of the dead. I thank you.